Captain David Reyes walked down the cold, echoing corridors of the Mars outpost, his heavy boots hitting the metallic floor with rhythmic precision. The station was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made even a seasoned soldier like David uneasy. He had been stationed on the Red Planet for nearly half a year, and while Mars had a desolate beauty to it, the isolation was starting to get to him. After years of high-stakes military missions on Earth, this assignment was supposed to be a break, a place where the greatest threat he faced was monotony. But today, there was something in the air, an oppressive stillness, thick with a sense of foreboding. The outpost itself was utilitarian, a long series of narrow halls in research labs, built to withstand the harsh Martian environment. Outside the narrow windows, the endless red landscape stretched out under a dim, rusty sky. Dust storms, frequent and violent, swept the barren plains, adding a new layer of isolation to an already remote existence. The clouds on the horizon today looked particularly menacing, signaling that another storm was coming. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing inside the station, in the heart of Captain Reyes. Captain Reyes, report to the diplomatic wing, immediately. The sterile voice in his earpiece interrupted his thoughts. The tone was crisp and professional, but the urgency was impossible to miss. He had been expecting this call all day, but that didn't make it any easier. With a deep breath, he straightened his uniform and continued his walk through the corridor, his mind racing. For the past few days, the entire station had been on edge, the usual calm routines disrupted by hushed conversations and vague orders from Earth. Something big was happening, but no one seemed willing or able to explain what. All he had been told was that the situation was unprecedented, a term that had been rattling around in his mind ever since. It had become almost a mantra, echoing the unanswered questions swirling in his thoughts. Now, as he approached the diplomatic wing, his gut told him that whatever was happening was far more than just another political negotiation. The doors to the diplomatic chamber slid open with a hiss, and David stepped inside, the tension in the air hitting him like a physical force. Seated around a large circular table were scientists, diplomats, and military personnel, each wearing an expression that ranged from grim to outright panic. But it wasn't their faces that caught his attention. In the far corner of the room stood a figure so striking, so utterly out of place, that for a moment David forgot how to breathe. She was tall, statuesque, and completely alien in appearance. Her skin, a deep shade of obsidian, shimmered as if it were made of liquid metal, catching the light in ways that human skin never could. Her golden eyes glowed softly, exuding both an ancient wisdom and a sharp, almost predatory intelligence, and her hair, long and silver, moved gently as though stirred by an invisible breeze. David's heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't fear that made his pulse race. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her. There was something about her presence that stirred a primal part of him, something he hadn't expected to feel in this sterile, cold room. She was mesmerizing, not just because she was alien, but because she exuded an aura of quiet strength and vulnerability all at once. His military training had prepared him for many things: combat, crisis, and survival. But not for this. Captain Reyes, the woman said, her voice low and rich, cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. There was a faint accent to her words, though it was unlike anything David had ever heard. Her golden eyes locked onto his, and for a split second, it felt as though the world had fallen away, leaving only the two of them in the room. "I've been briefed on the situation," David replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Though I'll admit, it's all been rather vague." Inside, however, his emotions were far from calm. Every fiber of his being was on high alert, but not in the way he'd been trained for in combat zones. No, this was different. This was personal, primal. The alien woman stepped closer to him, her movements fluid and graceful. "The situation is more dire than you know," she said softly, but her words carried a gravity that made the hairs on the back of David's neck stand on end. In the past few hours, David had been briefed on the basic outline of what was happening. The Illyrians, an ancient and advanced alien race, had made contact with humanity under dire circumstances. They were dying. A biological crisis had swept through their species, rendering them unable to reproduce. Their entire civilization was facing extinction. Despite their technological prowess, they had found no solution until now. They had come to Mars in search of an unthinkable solution. To create a hybrid child using human DNA, a desperate attempt to preserve their race. David exhaled slowly. He still hadn't wrapped his mind around it. The weight of it felt suffocating. "You said our DNA is compatible," he murmured, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "But why me? Why did you choose me?" For the first time, the alien's golden eyes softened. Her calm, unshakable composure wavered slightly, and David caught a glimpse of something beneath it: vulnerability. "Our geneticists have studied human DNA extensively," she explained. "Certain humans possess traits that make them ideal candidates for hybridization. You were chosen not just for your genetic compatibility, but for another reason." David frowned, confused. What other reason? She took another step toward him, and this time he felt the air around him shift, as though something deeper was connecting them. "You have affected me, David," she admitted, her voice soft but intense, "in ways I did not anticipate. My body responds to your presence. It is not something I can control." The rawness of her admission hit David like a punch. He had faced enemies on the battlefield, survived brutal missions, but nothing had prepared him for the way this alien woman, this utterly mesmerizing creature, was looking at him now. Her gaze was unrelenting, filled with something that went far beyond diplomacy or science. Before David could respond, her voice dropped even lower, filled with an emotion he hadn't expected to hear. "Human, we need to breed," she whispered, her words laced with an urgency that made his breath catch in his throat. "I will be your toy for life, if that's what it takes to save my people." David's mind reeled. The words were so direct, so intimate, that they felt almost surreal. And yet, the way she said them wasn't desperate. It was resolute, as though she had already accepted the weight of what she was asking. She wasn't pleading for her own sake, but for the survival of her entire species. And yet, despite the gravity of her words, there was something undeniably seductive about the way she spoke, the way her eyes never wavered from his. He felt the weight of the moment crash down on him. This was more than a mission. This was more than science. It was personal, inescapable. And the worst part was, as much as he tried to resist the pull he felt toward her, he knew deep down that he was already too far gone. David swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his ears as he took a step closer to her. Whatever came next, there was no turning back. Not from this. Captain David Ray stood frozen in place, the echo of Zara's words reverberating through him like a shockwave. The sterile, clinical walls of the Martian outpost felt suffocating now, as if the very air had grown heavier in response to the gravity of her proposal. He could still see her golden eyes, unwavering, waiting for him to react. Her words, "Human, we need to breed. I will be your toy for life," played over and over in his mind, sounding both desperate and resolute. This wasn't just a diplomatic mission anymore. It was something far more personal, far more intense than he had ever anticipated. He'd been briefed on the situation, yes, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. The Illyrians, Zara's people, were an ancient and advanced race, far beyond humanity in terms of technology and knowledge. Yet, despite their advancements, they faced a crisis no amount of scientific brilliance could solve. A biological catastrophe had swept through their species, rendering them unable to reproduce. Their future, once bright and unchallenged, now teetered on the brink of extinction. In their desperation, they had turned to the unlikeliest of allies, humans. David exhaled, his chest tightening under the weight of what Zara was asking. The idea of creating a hybrid child, a being that would carry both human and Illyrian DNA, was more than just a scientific experiment. It was a last-ditch effort to save an entire civilization, and they had chosen him, of all people, to be the one to father this new life. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, his mind racing. How could he, a soldier trained for battle, for discipline, for duty, possibly make sense of this? His entire life had been about service, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. But this was different. This wasn't about defending lives. It was about creating one. And not just any life, but one that would straddle the line between two vastly different species. "Why me?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. He needed to understand why he had been singled out. why it was his DNA that held the potential key to saving her people. Zara didn't hesitate. Her expression softened as she took a step closer, the room's cool, sterile air crackling with the intensity between them. "Your DNA is unique," she said, her voice rich with that same unplaceable accent, melodic but firm. "Our geneticists studied many human candidates. But you were different. There is something in your makeup, something resilient that gives us hope." David shook his head, trying to wrap his mind around the enormity of it. "Resilient? I'm just a soldier. There are millions of people on Earth, scientists, doctors, people far more qualified than I am. How could I be the one to help you?" Zara's gaze never wavered. "It is not just about qualifications, David. Our geneticists discovered that certain humans possess traits that make them more compatible with our species. But beyond that, there is something else, something deeper." He frowned. "Something deeper." She nodded, stepping closer until she was just a breath away from him. Her proximity made his pulse quicken, and despite the surreal nature of the conversation, there was an undeniable connection between them. "I cannot explain it in scientific terms," Zara admitted, her voice lowering, more intimate now. "But when I am near you, my body reacts. My instincts tell me that you are the one who can help us. Not just on a genetic level, but on a deeper, primal level." David's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. And something else, something far more dangerous. He had faced countless life or death situations before, been in battles where each decision could mean survival or death, but nothing had prepared him for this. The way Zara looked at him, the raw vulnerability in her eyes, stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in a long time. But even so, this wasn't a decision he could make lightly. "You're asking me to father a child with you," he said, his voice rough, the weight of those words settling heavily between them. "That's not something I ever imagined being a part of." Zara's eyes darkened slightly, not in anger, but in understanding. She could see his hesitation, feel the storm of emotions inside him. "I know this is not something you ever anticipated," she said quietly, and said, "I cannot force you to agree. But I am asking you not as a soldier, but as a woman whose people are dying. I need your help. Without it, there is no future for us." David swallowed hard, his throat tight. The responsibility she was placing on him felt immense, almost unbearable. How could he make such a choice? To say yes would mean becoming a part of something far bigger than himself, far bigger than anything he had ever been a part of. It wasn't just about science or survival anymore. It was about intimacy, about connection. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this," he admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I've always been about following orders, doing what's asked of me. But this is different. This is personal." Zara's gaze softened even more, and for a moment he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her golden eyes. Something fragile, hidden beneath her composed exterior. "It is personal," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I understand that. But it is also the only chance we have left. My people cannot reproduce. We have tried every solution, exhausted every resource. You are our last hope." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of the decision he was being asked to make. David felt like the walls were closing in around him, the air growing thin. He had always prided himself on being able to handle pressure, to make the tough calls when it mattered most. But this was different. He glanced out the window at the Martian landscape beyond, the storm clouds gathering in the distance, dark and swirling. The storm outside mirrored the one inside him, a chaotic world of thoughts, doubts, and emotions that he couldn't quite sort out. "I don't know if I can do this," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara stepped closer again, her presence magnetic, her eyes holding his in an unbreakable gaze. "You can," she said softly, but with a quiet strength. "I believe in you, David. I have felt the connection between us, even if you have not fully acknowledged it yet. This is not just about survival. It is about something deeper, something we cannot explain, but we both feel." Her words struck something deep inside him, a chord he hadn't realized was there. Despite everything, despite the impossibility of the situation, the overwhelming responsibility, there was a part of him that felt drawn to her, that wanted to help her, not just out of duty, but out of something more primal. David closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow, deep breath. When he opened them, Zara was still standing there, her expression soft but determined, her golden eyes reflecting the dim light of the station. She wasn't just asking for his help. She was offering him a connection, something real, something intimate. And he could feel it too, as much as he tried to resist. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed, the weight of the decision settling over him. "All right," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'll help you." Zara's shoulders relaxed slightly, though there was no relief in her expression, only a solemn understanding of the gravity of what he had just agreed to. "Thank you," she said softly. "You don't know what this means to my people." As the Martian storm howled outside, David realized that his life had just taken a turn he could never have predicted. He wasn't sure what the future held for him or for Zara, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The days after David Reyes made his decision were a blur of routine and unease, the weight of his choice pressing down on him like the heavy Martian atmosphere. The research station buzzed with its usual activity. Scientists hunched over their terminals, researchers conducting experiments in sterile labs. But everything felt different to him now. The sterile hum of the machinery, once a background noise, now seemed suffused with a tension he couldn't shake. Zara was never far from his thoughts, and when she was near, his mind became a tangled web of confusion, attraction, and something far more dangerous. At first, David had tried to bury himself in his duties, hoping the rigid structure of military life would help him make sense of the surreal situation. He had spent years training to keep his emotions in check, to follow orders without hesitation, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this. His mission, once a diplomatic task, had become something far more intimate and primal. The line between duty and personal involvement blurred more with each passing day, especially as the connection between him and Zara grew stronger. Zara's presence was magnetic. Whenever she entered a room, the air seemed to shift, as though her very existence altered the atmosphere. Even the other personnel at the station, though polite and professional, couldn't help but react to her in subtle ways, stiffening when she walked by, avoiding eye contact, and speaking in hushed tones when she was near. But for David, her effect was more profound. His heart would race when she was in the same room, his thoughts scrambled by the mere sound of her voice. It wasn't just her alien beauty that captivated him. It was something deeper, something he couldn't name but felt in every fiber of his being. It didn't take long for him to realize that their relationship, whatever it was evolving into something more than a professional alliance. Every time they were together, he felt a palpable tension, an attraction that tugged at him, even when he tried to ignore it. The way she moved, so fluid and graceful, like a predator in control of every step, fascinated him. Her golden eyes, intelligent and unblinking, often locked onto his, and in those moments, the rest of the world seemed to fall away. But it wasn't just physical. There was a pull between them, an undeniable bond that went beyond Zara's plea for his help. As much as he wanted to deny it, David felt the stirrings of something more, something dangerous. It wasn't just desire. It was deeper, more complex. The way she looked at him, the way her presence seemed to invade his thoughts, made him question everything. He had agreed to help her, to be part of a plan that would create a hybrid child to save her dying species. But it had never been just about genetics. It had always been about them. Something primal connected them, and no amount of rational thinking could change that. Zara, for her part, seemed equally affected, though she remained composed and dignified in front of the others. There were moments, fleeting, subtle, where David could see something deeper in her eyes. Her calm exterior would crack ever so slightly when they were alone, revealing a vulnerability she kept hidden from everyone else. It was in the way her gaze would linger on him just a fraction too long, in the softening of her voice when they spoke, and it was in the tension that hummed between them whenever they were close, like an electric current neither of them could control. One evening, as David sat alone in the observation room, staring out at the Martian landscape, Zara entered silently, her footsteps barely audible on the cold metallic floor. The station's lights were dimmed for the night, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the endless expanse of red dunes stretched out under the faint light of Mars' twin moons. Dust storms swirled in the distance, their fury barely visible through the reinforced windows. David Zara's voice broke the silence, soft and melodic, but it carried a weight that made his chest tighten. He turned to face her, heart quickening at the sight of her. She stood at the entrance, her tall, statuesque form illuminated by the dim glow of the station lights. Her silver hair shimmered like liquid metal, flowing down her back in gentle waves, and her golden eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver through him. "Zara," he replied, his voice betraying the tension he felt. He had been trying to avoid being alone with her, afraid of what might happen if he let himself get too close. But now, with her standing there, her gaze never wavering, he knew there was no escaping the inevitable. She walked toward him, each step measured and graceful, until she was standing just a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "I know this has been difficult for you," Zara said finally, her voice softer now, almost vulnerable. "I know what I'm asking of you goes beyond duty, beyond anything you ever expected." David nodded, unable to find the words to express the storm of emotions swirling inside him. How could he explain the confusion, the desire, the fear that had gripped him since their first meeting? How could he put into words the pull he felt toward her, a pull that had only grown stronger with each passing day? "I don't understand why this is happening," he admitted, his voice rough with the weight of the truth. "I'm a soldier. I'm supposed to follow orders, not feel like this." Zara's eyes softened, and for the first time since he had met her, David saw something fragile in her gaze. She took a step closer, and the air between them seemed to grow even thicker, charged with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "I feel it too," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the station. "This connection between us, it's not just biology, it's something more. Something I don't fully understand either." David swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent weeks trying to suppress the emotions that surged every time they were near each other. But now, standing this close to her, he couldn't fight it any longer. There was something between them, something undeniable, and it terrified him. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "This isn't just about saving your people anymore. It's..." Zara didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out, her hand brushing against his arm in the lightest of touches. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through him, and for a moment, all the tension, all the fear and confusion, melted away, leaving only the raw connection between them. "I don't know," she admitted quietly, her golden eyes searching his. "But I do know that I can't ignore this any longer. I've tried to stay focused on my mission, on what I came here to do, but you've made it impossible." David's breath hitched in his throat. He had been trained to control his emotions, to remain detached in even the most dangerous situations. But this was different. This wasn't a mission or a battle. This was something far more intimate, far more personal. "I've tried too," he confessed, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But every time I see you, every time we're in the same room, it's like I can't think straight." Zara took another step closer, her hand now resting on his chest, the warmth of her touch radiating through him. "I feel the same," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "This connection between us, it's real, and I don't think we can fight it anymore." David closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside him. He had faced life or death situations before, but this was about more than survival. It was about trust, about vulnerability, about letting go of the rigid control he had always relied on. When he opened his eyes, Zara was still standing there, her golden gaze unwavering, her hand still resting on his chest. In that moment, he knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The bond between them, fragile and complex, was too strong to ignore any longer. Without thinking, without hesitating, David reached up and gently cupped her face in his hands. Her skin was warm, softer than he had imagined, and as their eyes met, he saw the same turmoil reflected in her gaze. The same conflict, the same desire. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The station, the mission, the impending crisis, all of it faded away, leaving only the two of them standing in the dimly lit room, hearts pounding in unison. Then, slowly, cautiously, David leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in the lightest of kisses. It was tentative at first, hesitant, as though they were both unsure of where this would lead. But as the kiss deepened, as the connection between them solidified into something undeniable. All the doubts, all the fears melted away when they finally pulled apart. Breathless and wide-eyed, David knew that everything had changed. The attraction between them, the bond that had been simmering beneath the surface, was no longer something they could ignore. Zara's hand remained on his chest, her golden eyes filled with a mixture of longing and uncertainty. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David swallowed hard, his mind still reeling from the intensity of the moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know one thing. We can't go back. Not after this." Zara nodded, her expression solemn but resolute. "No," she agreed softly. The connection between them had crossed a line, one they could never retreat from. They had both tried to fight it, to remain focused on the mission, but now that they had given in to the pull between them, there was no turning back. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The days following their shared moment in the observation room were marked by an unspoken tension, a fragile line neither Captain David Reyes nor Zara dared to cross too soon. Though they had shared a kiss, an acknowledgement of the undeniable bond between them, there was still the heavy reality of what that connection meant. It was no longer just about attraction or the intensity of their feelings. The future of an entire species rested on what they would decide next, and that made everything more complicated. David tried to focus on his duties, throwing himself into his work, into the routine inspections and security protocols of the outpost. But no amount of discipline could keep his thoughts from drifting back to her. Zara, she lingered in his mind like a song he couldn't shake. Her voice, her touch, and the quiet desperation in her eyes the night they kissed. The situation was unlike anything he had ever faced, and no amount of training had prepared him for the gravity of the choice he was now expected to make. He found himself standing in the medical bay late one evening, the sterile scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. The lights were dimmed, and the faint hum of machines echoed in the background. Zara was seated across the room, her tall, graceful figure silhouetted against the soft glow of the equipment. She had been there for hours discussing options with Dr. Harper, the station's lead scientist, going over genetic data, simulations and projections of what a successful hybrid child might mean for both their species. As David approached, Zara looked up, her golden eyes meeting his with that same calm intensity she always carried. But beneath it, he could see the uncertainty, the weight of the decision they were both about to make. "David," she said softly, her voice cutting through the sterile quiet of the room. "We need to talk." He nodded, pulling up a chair to sit across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with the enormity of what lay ahead. He knew what she was going to say, but part of him still wasn't ready to hear it. "We've gone over the data," Zara began, her voice steady but laced with a hint of tension. "There are two ways we can proceed. The first is through artificial insemination. Dr. Harper and her team have assured me that the process is safe, and it's what our scientists would consider the most efficient option. It would minimize risk, and—" David nodded, his heart heavy as he listened. The sterile, controlled environment of a lab felt like the logical choice, the one that would keep emotions at bay, make this a matter of science rather than something more personal. But deep down, he knew there was another option, and that option hung between them like an unspoken truth. "And the second?" David asked, his voice low. Zara hesitated, her eyes flickering with a brief moment of vulnerability. She looked away for a second, as though gathering her thoughts, before meeting his gaze again. "The second option would be natural conception. It's what some of our scientists believe would create a stronger hybrid, one where the bond between the parents influences the development of the child. It's more than just about DNA, it's about the connection between us." David's breath hitched in his throat at her words. This was the choice that had haunted him since the beginning. The idea of fathering a child with her was already overwhelming, but the thought of doing so in the most intimate, personal way possible, that was something he had struggled to wrap his mind around. He ran a hand through his hair, leaning back in his chair as he tried to process everything. "So, you're saying that if we do this the natural way, it could improve the chances of the hybrid success?" He tried to keep his tone neutral, though inside, his emotions churned. Zara nodded, her expression solemn. "Yes, it's not a guarantee, of course, but the bond between us, if we choose to go that route, could strengthen the chances of the child surviving, of carrying the best traits of both our species. She paused, her eyes searching his face. But this isn't something I would ever force on you, David. It has to be your choice. Her words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their implications. David felt the pressure mounting, the conflict inside him reaching a breaking point. The clinical option seemed safer, more distant, something that wouldn't blur the lines between duty and the deepening emotions he felt for her. But the natural option, the one that required true intimacy, wasn't just about biology. It was about acknowledging the connection they already shared, about embracing the feelings that had been simmering between them since the moment they met. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the strength behind her calm exterior. This wasn't just a plea for survival. It was personal. Zara had let down her walls in front of him, allowed him to see her vulnerability, her fear for her people's future. Now she was leaving the decision in his hands. David took a deep breath, his chest tightening as he struggled to find the right words. Zara, I never thought I'd be in this position. I never thought I'd have to make a decision like this. I know, she said softly, her voice gentle but firm. I never thought I'd ask it of anyone, let alone you. But we don't have much time. My people, they're running out of options. And you've become part of this, part of our survival. The room felt smaller now, the air between them charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the clinical surroundings of the medical bay. It was raw, real, and impossible to ignore. David could feel the weight of Zara's words settling on his shoulders, the responsibility of what she was asking of him, and the truth of how deeply connected they had become. I don't want this to be just about science, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I want this to be about trust, about us. I need to know that whatever happens, we're in this together. Her words struck something deep inside him. It wasn't just about saving her species anymore, and they both knew it. This was about them, about the undeniable bond that had grown between them, despite everything. He had tried to keep it professional, tried to focus on the mission, but the truth was that Zara had become more than just a diplomatic partner. She had become someone he cared about deeply. David's chest tightened as he realized what he had to do. He couldn't choose the distant, clinical path, not when his feelings for her had become so intertwined with the mission. He couldn't pretend this was just about duty anymore. He reached out, taking her hand in his, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. Zara, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. If we're going to do this, I want it to be real. I want it to mean something. Not just for your people, but for us. Zara's eyes softened, and for the first time, David saw a flicker of hope in her gaze. She squeezed his hand gently, her golden eyes shimmering in the dim light of the room. Thank you, she whispered. I never wanted this to be just a transaction. I wanted it to be a choice we made together. And with that, the intimacy between them deepened. No longer just an unspoken tension, but a choice. A decision to face the future together no matter what it held. They weren't just creating a life to save a species. They were acknowledging the connection they had fought so hard to deny. The storm outside the Arkham research station had been building for hours, the fierce winds of Mars howling against the station's reinforced walls. Dust swirled in dense, violent clouds, blocking out the weak light of the Martian sky. Inside, the atmosphere was no less charged. Captain David Ray stood by the narrow window in his quarters, staring out at the raging storm, but his mind was elsewhere, far removed from the barren landscape outside. His thoughts were consumed by Zara, the alien emissary who had turned his world upside down. His free tension between them had been building for days, ever since that conversation in the medical bay, where they had acknowledged the choice before them, to proceed clinically, with distance, or to embrace the natural path, one that demanded intimacy. David had made his decision then, but the gravity of what they were about to do still weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just a mission anymore. It wasn't just about saving Zara's people. It was about the bond they shared, a connection that had grown stronger with every passing moment. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and for a brief second, David's heart raced in anticipation. He already knew who it was. Come in, he called, his voice steady. Though his pulse quickened, the door slid open with a soft hiss, and Zara stepped into the room. Her presence was like a shift in the atmosphere, calm yet charged. as though the storm outside had brought its energy in with her. She stood just inside the doorway, her tall, statuesque form framed by the dim light of the corridor. Her silver hair shimmered in the low light, cascading down her back like liquid metal, and her golden eyes found his with that same intensity that always seemed to make the world around them fade away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. Zara's gaze was soft, but there was a determination in her expression, an understanding that they were standing on the edge of something monumental. The winds outside howled louder, rattling the windows as if the storm itself could sense the tension inside the room. David's chest tightened as he looked at her, feeling the weight of everything they had been through. Every battle he had fought, every life or death decision he had made, seemed simple compared to this. This was personal, intimate, and infinitely more complicated. He had agreed to help her save her people, but now it was about more than just survival. It was about them. Zara stepped forward, her movements fluid and graceful, her eyes never leaving his. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost lost in the sounds of the storm, but it carried the same strength she always held within her. "I know this is hard for you," she said, her words gentle yet firm. "But I need you to know that this is not just about my people anymore. It's about us. Whatever happens next, we face it together." David swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He had spent so long trying to distance himself, to keep his feelings in check, but he couldn't deny it any longer. There was no more hiding behind the mission, no more pretending this was just about duty. The connection between them had grown too strong, too undeniable. "I know," he whispered, his voice rough with the weight of his own emotions. "I've tried to keep this professional, to focus on the mission, but I can't anymore. Not with you." Zara's eyes softened, and for the first time, David saw a flicker of vulnerability behind her calm exterior. She took another step closer, closing the distance between them, her gaze never wavering. "You don't have to fight it," she said quietly. "You don't have to be alone in this." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he brushed a strand of her silver hair away from her face. Her skin was warm beneath his touch, warmer than he had expected, and the simple act of touching her sent a surge of electricity through him. It was as though the storm outside mirrored the storm of emotions raging inside him, building to a crescendo he could no longer hold back. "I'm not used to this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've always been trained to act, to follow orders, to be in control. But with you, everything is different." Zara's gaze softened even more, and she reached up to gently take his hand in hers, her touch sending a wave of calm through him that he couldn't explain. "I feel it too," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This connection between us, it's not something I expected, but I can't ignore it. And I don't want to." David's heart pounded in his chest as he looked into her eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle deep inside him. For so long, he had tried to keep his emotions at bay, tried to pretend that this was just another mission. But he couldn't lie to himself any longer. He had been drawn to her from the moment they met. And now, standing here with her, he realized that he didn't want to fight it anymore. Without another word, he closed the distance between them, his hand slipping around the back of her neck as he pulled her toward him. Their lips met in a slow, tender kiss, the intensity of it building as the walls they had both tried so hard to maintain came crashing down. The kiss deepened, and the tension that had been simmering between them for days finally erupted into something raw, something powerful. Zara's hand slid up his chest, her touch igniting a fire in him that he couldn't contain. He had never felt anything like this before. This overwhelming need, this undeniable connection. It was as if all the uncertainty, all the fear, melted away in the heat of the moment, leaving only the two of them, bound together by something neither of them fully understood. The storm outside raged on, the winds howling against the station's walls. But inside, the world had narrowed to just them. David's hands roamed over her body, his touch both gentle and urgent, as though he couldn't get enough of her. Zara responded in kind, her fingers tracing the lines of his muscles, her body pressing against his as their kiss grew more passionate, more desperate. It wasn't just about desire, though, that was there, simmering just beneath the surface. It was about something deeper, something primal. This was a merging of more than just bodies. It was a merging of lives, of destinies. Zara broke the kiss first, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she rested her forehead against his. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the same emotions that gripped him. "We don't have to do this if you're not ready." David's heart swelled at her words, at the vulnerability she was showing him. She wasn't just asking for his help. She was asking for his trust, for his commitment to something bigger than either of them. And in that moment, he knew his answer. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he whispered, his voice filled with conviction. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." Zara's eyes filled with a quiet, fierce determination, and she nodded, her golden gaze locking onto his. Together, she agreed, her voice strong, steady. And with that, they let go of the last of their hesitation, surrendering fully to the storm of passion that had been building between them. As the Martian winds howled outside, they found solace in each other, their connection deepening with every touch, every kiss. In that moment, it wasn't just about saving her people or fulfilling a duty. It was about them, about the undeniable bond that had brought them together against all odds. The future was uncertain, the path ahead fraught with challenges they couldn't yet foresee. But in each other's arms, they found the strength to face whatever was to come. The storm raged on. But inside, there was only the calm of their shared intimacy, the quiet understanding that, together, they could weather anything. The morning after the storm, the Arkham research station was unnaturally quiet. Outside, the Martian landscape lay in stillness, the dust having settled from the violent storm that had raged through the night. Inside the station, it was a different kind of stillness, a calm after the whirlwind of emotions and decisions that had swept David Reyes and Zara into a new chapter of their intertwined lives. David stood by one of the observation windows, staring out at the endless expanse of red dunes. The sun was rising, casting a pale orange glow over the desolate terrain. But David's mind was far from the scenery. He had spent the night with Zara, and the intimacy they had shared wasn't just physical. It had been a turning point, a moment when they had both fully embraced the connection between them. They had crossed a line that neither of them could retreat from. It wasn't just about saving her species anymore. It was about them, about what they had become to each other. And with that realization came a new weight of responsibility. The station remained mostly silent, as the early hours meant fewer personnel were moving around, and the atmosphere seemed to mirror the gravity of David's thoughts. He wasn't just a soldier on a mission anymore. He wasn't just protecting a diplomat or ensuring a peace treaty. He had become part of something much bigger, something that would change the course of two species, human and Illyrian alike. The door to his quarters slid open softly, and Zara stepped in, her presence immediately pulling him out of his thoughts. She moved with her usual grace, her long silver hair flowing behind her like liquid metal, her golden eyes finding his with a quiet intensity that made his chest tighten. She looked radiant in the dim light, though there was a noticeable exhaustion behind her eyes, a reflection of the emotional and physical toll of the previous night. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice carrying the same calm, melodic tone that always seemed to soothe him. David turned to face her fully, offering a small smile in return. "Morning." His voice was rough, still weighed down by everything he had been processing. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Zara moved closer, standing beside him as they both looked out at the Martian horizon. The silence between them wasn't awkward or tense. It was filled with the understanding of everything they had shared, everything they had committed to. "How do you feel?" Zara asked gently, her voice barely above a whisper. David took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair as he considered her question. "I don't really know," he admitted. "Everything feels different now. Everything's changed." Zara nodded, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Yes, it has," she agreed, her tone steady, but laced with the same uncertainty he felt. "We've set something in motion that can't be undone." David turned to look at her, studying her profile in the soft light. "Do you regret it?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and David's heart raced as he waited for her response. He didn't know what he expected her to say, whether she felt the same conflict he did, or if she was more resolute in her decision. Zara finally met his gaze, her golden eyes soft but firm. "No," she said simply. "I don't regret it. I knew from the moment I met you that this was a path we were meant to walk together. Whatever happens next, I know that I've made the right choice. Her words brought a wave of relief crashing over him, though it didn't completely wash away the weight of everything that lay ahead. There was still so much they didn't know, so many uncertainties about the future they had committed to. But in that moment, hearing her reassurance, David knew that they had made the right decision for them, even if the rest of the world wouldn't understand. I'm just trying to figure out what comes next, David said, his voice quieter now. We're not just dealing with the station anymore. We're dealing with the future, yours, mine, and whatever comes from this. Zara's expression softened, and she reached out, gently placing her hand on his arm. Her touch, as always, grounded him, reminded him that they weren't facing this alone. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. Together. We've come this far and we'll face whatever comes next, no matter how difficult. David looked down at her hand resting on his arm, feeling the warmth of her skin against his. The bond between them, forged in a strange mix of duty, desire, and something deeper, felt unbreakable now. The weight of the future still hung over him. But Zara's presence, her belief in what they were doing, gave him the strength to face it. Together, he echoed, meeting her gaze once more. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, hope perhaps, or maybe something even more profound, something unspoken but understood between them. A soft chime interrupted their moment, signaling an incoming message on David's personal comm device. He pulled it out of his pocket, glancing at the screen. Dr. Harper had requested an update on Zara's condition, as well as a meeting to discuss the next steps in the hybridization process. David sighed, his mind reluctantly shifting back to the practicalities of the mission. There was so much that still needed to be done, so many questions to answer, so many protocols to follow. The hybrid child they were trying to create would be a groundbreaking achievement, but it also carried risks, both scientific and political. Earth wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. Neither would the radical factions that viewed collaboration with aliens as a betrayal of humanity. He turned back to Zara. Dr. Harper wants to meet with us. I think it's time to discuss the next steps. What we need to do to ensure everything goes smoothly. Zara nodded, though there was a shadow of concern that crossed her face. I know it won't be easy, she said quietly, but we have to trust that what we're doing is the right thing for both our species. David leaned against the window, exhaling slowly as he let her words sink in. He had always been a man of action, someone who dealt with problems head-on, but this was different. This wasn't just about strategy or tactics. It was about shaping the future in ways he had never imagined. I'm ready, Zara added, her voice resolute. Whatever we have to face, I'm ready. David looked at her, seeing the strength in her eyes, the determination that had drawn him to her from the beginning. Despite the uncertainty, despite the risks, she was willing to move forward with him, to face whatever challenges awaited them together. And in that moment, he realized he was ready too. He pushed off from the window, his mind clearer now. The path ahead still difficult, but no longer as overwhelming. Then let's get started, he said, his voice steady with resolve. We've got a lot of work to do. As they left the room together, the Martian sun rising higher in the sky, David couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace settle over him. The challenges they faced were immense, and the future was still uncertain. But they had each other, and for now, that was enough. The new beginning they had chosen wasn't going to be easy, but it was theirs. And as they walked down the corridor side by side, David felt a surge of hope for the first time in what felt like a lifetime.